Good evening and a very warm welcome to our panel discussion, Relevance of Bauhaus Today. This is our last event in a series of 4 conversations reflecting different aspects of the Bauhaus, the famous art and design school and movement at the beginning of the 20th century. This series of events functions as a prelude to and an intensifier of the exhibition responding to Bauhaus Imaginista collected research at the Indian Museum, which is presented by the Indian Museum, the Ministry of Culture, the Government of India, and the Goethe-Institut, Max Müller-Bhavan, Kolkata. Bauhaus Imaginista, curated by Marion von Osten and Grant Watson, was a major research and exhibition project focusing on the international reception of the Bauhaus and how it had been influential on, and at the same time be influenced by art and design movements worldwide. The collected archive material from this exhibition is a core of the Calcutta presentation, and it is contextualized by a newly commissioned architectural installation by the Indian artist Sanchayan Ghosh, who has been invited to respond to this archive and connected to the setting of the India Museum and to its collection. Today's panel will focus on the relevance of Bauhaus today and the question which of the Bauhaus ideas and innovations in the field of art, architecture, design, and education are still relevant after more than 100 years in a world which is characterized by an increasing homogenization through globalization. The panel will review the relevance of Bauhaus today in relationship to lifestyle, science, art, and environment. I'm very pleased to say that we have 3 distinguished guests today: Suchitra Balasubrahmanyan, Alison Crawshaw, and Kaiwan Mehta, who will moderate the panel discussion. Kaiwan Mehta is a theorist and critic in the fields of visual culture, architecture, and urban studies. He has studied architecture, literature, Indian aesthetics, and cultural studies. Since March 2012, he has been the managing editor of Domus India. He is also professor and program chair of the doctoral program at the Faculty of Architecture of CPT University in Ahmedabad. He is an internationally acclaimed lecturer and author, and he also co-curated the national exhibition, The State of Architecture, Practices and Processes in India at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai, as well as State of Housing, Aspirations, Imaginaries, and Realities in India. Mr. Mehta has been elected as a jury chairman for the International Artist Residency Program at the Akademie Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart in Germany. And he also has been curating the urban design and architecture section of the Kala Goda Art Festival in Mumbai since 2016. Mr. Mehta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Astrid, for this introduction to the event, and thank you for the introduction to me as well. And thank you to both, to you, Astrid and Sharmishta, for putting all of us together in this conversation. Let me begin, and this is going to be a double. It's going to be a kind of an introduction to the panel, but it's also partly a presentation from my end on this subject. And I come to this question in a way as to why do we ask this question? What is the relevance of the Bauhaus? If we ask this as a rubric question, then there is a doubt. Why, if we are asking the relevance question, maybe it is not relevant, and that's why we are wondering why it is not relevant. If we ask this question at a granular level, then maybe there are details to be thought about which see the Bauhaus as relevant. And in what ways is it relevant? Is it trickle down? Is it a certain kind of a wave that has come and gone and come and gone for different reasons? So I think there are different ways in which we can ask this question of relevance. And I think this may simply be an occasion for us to sort of think of many intellectual and political movements and ideas which have either influenced or been a part of design, art, and architecture histories, and how they have sort of survived, or what kind of afterlives they have had in our contemporary, or how do they exist in our contemporary, prominently, quietly, subtle, and in what ways? That's, I think, one question that this occasion has got me to ask. And by this occasion, I don't mean simply this panel discussion, but since the last 2, 3, 4 years, I think this question of 100 years of Bauhaus has been around, and many of us have got involved in responding to that question. And my first response was, why am I being asked to respond to this question? Why should I respond to this question? The second thing is that it's also an occasion, at least for me, and the kind of work that one has been involved in, especially research and some of the exhibitions that Astrid mentioned, where one is sort of trying to look at histories, trying to look at more recent past histories, more contemporary histories, which becomes more difficult because you're sitting in the middle of the history that you're trying to look at, think about, etc. And you're wondering, in what ways are you going to take a grasp on these histories? Why do you want to rewrite some of, either not completely rewrite histories at all points in times, but certain moments of those histories you are thinking of rewrite, or you're trying to figure out frameworks because some of the earlier frameworks are not comfortable to you. And clearly one of the frameworks that is totally not useful has been the simple framework of West and East, or European and Indian, or English and Indian, and we keep suffering this binary constantly. And on another side, there has been this sort of a parallel to that, has been to ask the question, if this is what I thought of public space by reading so-called the canons of Western thinking, then what would public space read as if I read something Indian? I think that's an equally Orientalist and equally boring and equally problematic way of shifting the lens. So I think these two, the question of this binary between the East and the West, and the question of searching for something that is Indian, is equally problematic. And one has been sort of interested in looking at landscapes that are more defined by questions of their own histories, by questions of their own politics, by their own historical moments, rather than sort of segregating them into continents and regions and locations of nations and borders and boundaries and that kind of a thing. So after having made these clarifications, what I would sort of, or some of these propositions, what I would also like to do is narrate in a little bit of a biographical way the way I got involved in 100 years of Bauhaus. Not because I was interested particularly in the Bauhaus, somebody who's trained as an architect, somebody who teaches architecture. Bauhaus is a moment in a textbook of history. You talk about it, we know it's influential, but there's also the history of how, for example, something like the Beaux-Arts has come into architecture education or design education in India, as much as we recognize that some of the design exercises, design teaching methods have come from the Bauhaus as well. Or sort of, you've grown up thinking or talking about ornament and crime, and the first time I read that essay properly, I don't know why people raved about that essay. Why couldn't somebody see the politics in that essay rather than sort of taking its titles? So you encountered a lot of things in your training process, but when you're sort of shaping your own imagination, which is located in certain areas of your interest, some of these sort of given facts start becoming questions. And the first time that so I was involved in the first, I think, exhibition that happened in Germany, and which I still believe was probably one of the largest and probably one of the most well-researched exhibitions, most critical exhibitions about the Bauhaus, was 100 years of Bauhaus at the Kunstverein in Stuttgart, which was the general curators were the directors of the Kunstverein, Hans Christ and Iris Dressler. And it also involved many other curators, including me as one of them. And Iris and Hans have been colleagues, have been friends, have been collaborators. I knew them for a long period of 10 years. So I knew their work and they knew my work. And Iris sort of told me that, this is the exhibition that we are going to work on. Would you be sort of interested to participate, do a section of the exhibition, maybe from the India perspective, etc. And the first thing I told her is I have no interest in the Bauhaus in that sense. Not any particular interest. As a general interest in world knowledge, yes, but no particular interest in the Bauhaus. But I told her that since I was involved with setting up the Parsons New School program in Bombay, when they experimented setting up a school in Bombay, and at the same time, as somebody who's been an academic for the last 20 years, etc., one has been interested in design pedagogy, whether it's architecture or general design. Today, there is a flourish of design in India because it's an economic condition that allows for a lot of lifestyle design to flourish, which is why everybody calls themselves a designer in that way. So I said there are many questions around design, which are either in terms of education and pedagogy, or in terms of the general environment that one is sort of commenting upon. There are things that are disturbing. There are things that are sort of one wants to investigate and see how one can sort of put it in education, put it in teaching, put it in sort of conversations, public conversations, etc. So I said I have an interest in design, and especially to look at the design history of India, because I also don't accept and agree that the design history of India is 5,000 years old or 3,000 years old. Just because you made objects, it does not automatically become design history. So I said, see, because of my own research work in Bombay, in fact, looking at, I had got interested in ornamentation, especially 19th century architecture and design. I have two wonderful museums right in my city. One is formerly the Prince of Wales Museum, which is now the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya, and the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, which was formerly the Victoria and Albert Museum of Bombay. And I can see two different ideologies set up two museums and how they work today. As somebody who's interested in architecture education in India, there is the Sir J.J. School of Arts, which then had the architecture department, then had a separate school of architecture, etc. And I have myself come up, grown literally in one of the fresh schools that came up in the 1990s, literally 30, 40 years after independence, when suddenly there was a boom in schools of architecture, which is completely set up on a different ideology, and one could sort of see that, one could reflect on that. So I said I have a running interest in design histories because I am sort of making ornamentation my main area of entering into questions of urban space, urban public, etc. And ornamentation has obviously, on the one hand, taken me to Ornament and Crime, but has also taken me to Siegfried Kracauer and the way he looked at ornament. Obviously, Walter Benjamin was another sort of a father figure, literally sitting there on some of these questions. But on the other hand, you have the whole tradition of Ruskin and Morris and the arts and crafts movement. So I said, one is sort of juggling these different worlds that has, through design, raised so many questions of the notion of public, the notion of production, the notion of nations, the notion of culture, the notion of civilization. And I said, I'm interested in these broad questions. So if you're okay, I can bring some of these broad questions from the history I am interested in. But that may not be simply saying why I want to sort of kiss the Bauhaus because the Bauhaus is celebrating 100 years. I said, if the Bauhaus is celebrating 100 years, let Bauhaus ask those questions. Why should the rest of the world ask those questions? So that structure was a little problematic for me. And and Iris and Hans, being Iris and Hans, if any one of you in the audience or the organizers would know them, they were obviously excited with this idea. And I set up what was then the sort of the Little India Pavilion at the 100 Years of Bauhaus Kunstverein show in the Stuttgart Kunstverein. And what I essentially did is, in my sort of interest, research, work, etc., what I had began to get fascinated with and done a certain amount of research, even while teaching Indian aesthetics, questions of Raja Ravi Verma, Orientalism, etc. On the one hand, one was reading the fantastic work from Tapati Guha Thakurta. And I think this conversation cannot move ahead without acknowledging the foundational work that Tapati Guha Thakurta has done in this area. Obviously, other contributors and researchers, important books like Partha Mittal also. But what had sort of emerged for me was to look at the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition, which as an architecture student, you only encountered as this sort of high moment of glass and steel architecture. And without knowing what was the trade and cultural impact of the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition. And another work I have to acknowledge at this point is Arindam's work, which is in this beautiful book called The Bureaucracy of Beauty, where he literally gets into the history of the Department of the Science and Arts, which comes out of the 1851 Crystal Palace, which shapes into the Kensington Museum and School, which actually becomes the shape of the Sir J.J. College of Architecture, and this whole structure, and the Victoria and Albert in Bombay, because the Kensington becomes the Victoria and Albert in London. And that history of setting up a certain pedagogy, which was also to sort of locate in a region, and that's where the work of Kipling or the work of Havel, all these who were the principals of the local schools. There were 4 schools set up: Lahore, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras. And the principles were very, very important in how they sort of translated and interpreted this program that came from the DSA, etc. So for me, literally, and in my sort of argument, the history of design in India is with 1851 Crystal Palace, not with Indus Valley civilization. I would look at the history, and the beautiful history, obviously, of Indus Valley civilization with a different structure and with a different template in that sense. I don't see the 1851, either the 19th century or colonialism, as a break, but I see it as the beginning of a different kind of a history as compared to certain other histories that exist. So the parallelness of histories is very, very important. And for me, to understand the Bauhaus would be, and that's the structure that I adopted in this exhibition, that I want to see a parallel history. And those interested in Bauhaus can learn from the parallelness of two histories. I would sort of love that in many, many ways. So for me, sort of to look at 1851, this history of setting up what happens in Bombay, was an important starting point. And in many locations, I have found that when you look at the national history, even of India, through the lens and perspective of Bombay, you get a little bit of a different viewpoint as compared to sort of, Ahmedabad has self-christened itself as and I'm quite critical of it today. I think it was important at one point in our histories. But, Ahmedabad has sort of got christened as the Mecca of modernism, modern architecture, modern design, because of SEPT, because of NID, etc., those histories, Corbusier going there, and the beautiful patronage that you continue to get in Ahmedabad. One cannot refuse that. So the question of patronage in Ahmedabad is very interesting, or Delhi, which becomes the automatic center, or Calcutta, which is the center before Delhi in that sense. But Bombay has a unique history of being this sort of trade location that is happy with its trade history. So whether I look at an architect on whom I write a book later, which is the architecture of the architect I.M. Kadri, or even if you look at the architecture of somebody like Charles Correa, or something that I just opened an exhibition yesterday, the architecture of Rahul Mehrotra, who himself just a year ago compiled his own work in a book called Working from Mumbai. So in that sense, when something is happening in this trade location, and the city of Bombay, which is not the capital city, which is not the Mecca of design or any such thing, but it's simply a trade capital, it becomes very interesting to see how this city has helped larger publics imagine what it means to be modern, what it means to be public, what it also may mean to be Indian, if you want to sort of take that question. Very often I joke, standing at the gateway of India in Bombay, that when you're standing at the gateway of India, what you see on the other side is actually the Indian mainland. So also sort of geographically, Bombay is sort of tongue-in-cheek interesting, because you're standing on Bombay, but on the other hand, you see India, the landmass of India on the other side. Obviously, we are connected, because otherwise nationalists will get irritated with me that I'm saying this. But well, don't worry, we are connected geographically, and we love everything on the mainland. But yes, there is a sense of separation with the eastern side of the waterfront with the mainland, and I think that's an interesting thing about Bombay, that it allows for this sense of distance. And I think there are many cities in many countries like that. Like very often people say Berlin is not Germany, and very often people say New York is not America, or what is America and New York is very different in other parts of the continent. And I think that's the same for Bombay. So to look at 1851, to look at that, and then what I had discussed with Hans and Iris was that, see, what is happening is that there are many common thematics. There are many common things that are emerging, which are probably not about the schools or about the particular histories, but it's probably about the spirit of the time. So in a sense, there is a 19th century moment. There are different forms of colonialism. Germany is in different parts of the world in a very different way than what England is in different parts of the world, or what France is in different parts of the world. Portugal is in different parts of the world, including in India. You have sort of 4 European powers of importance, and they all have very different ways of handling this relationship between Europe and India, Europe and Asia, kind of a thing. Obviously, we know the dominant one is the English colonialism in India. And to sort of say that, for example, one of the themes that I picked up, which was my interest, which was ornament and craftsmanship, because I was also a little fed up and tired of this sort of celebrating the craftsman as if it is a figure hanging in mid-air without an outside of history. And I think one is very early on in my studies and in my teaching of Indian aesthetics, developing a critical review of somebody like Kumaraswamy's work, who is sort of early 20th century. And then also I should acknowledge the work of other contemporary Indian thinkers or thinkers from India, such as Jyotindra Jain, such as Annapurna Garimella or Nancy Adajania, whose work also helped me to sort of figure out my own way of getting into the question of craftsmanship, where the craftsman is not out of caste, the craftsman is not out of labor rights, the craftsman is not out of his or her own personal, private, regional biographies in that way. And this question of looking at ornamentation and craftsmen was very important for me. The second question that I was interested in was what I mentioned earlier, which is the structure of setting up a pedagogy and setting up a museum for pedagogy. So this sort of training through objects and how objects become public objects, but objects are also objects for training. So even today, if you see the sculpture gallery at the JJ School of Arts, it's fantastic, it's fascinating. And obviously the Baudaji Art Museum is fascinating. And the Baudaji Art Museum sits in the Botanical Gardens and the Zoological Gardens in Bombay. So whether it's animals, whether it's plants, or whether it's design, all of them are part of the same tradition of how you think about region and culture in that way. So the second thing was structures of pedagogy and exhibition. That became important for me. And the third was the relationship. Why do we sort of relate? Which way it flows, I leave it open, because I leave it open even for myself. Design influencing questions of nation and nationalism, or nation influencing questions. Do we preconceive the notion of the nation and then superimpose it on a design history, which is what we do, I think? Or sort of design generates a question? Is it automatic in the nature of design to generate questions on the idea of the nation, the idea of the region, the idea of the people? So whether it's 1851 Crystal Palace, or whether it's the festivals of India that happened in the 1980s, I think these questions remain. They may change their grain, but they remain as large questions. So in the exhibition that I put up, I literally looked at the history of 3 moments of exhibition making as far as India is concerned. One was 1851 Crystal Palace, which I think is many, many ways interesting for the history of Bombay, the history of JJ School of Arts. It's important for the Baroda location of Baroda, the museum there, fantastic museum. Again, if you know that history, its education program, etc. To look at the moment of the festivals of India, where Indira Gandhi and Pupul Jaikar put these festivals of India as a certain kind of a culture, economic, diplomacy, though that moment. And then I looked at the moment of something that was mentioned in my introduction, the state of architecture in India, which I had co-curated, with Rahul Mehrotra and Ranjit Hoskote. And this notion of large exhibition, there were many other important ones like Aditi, the other design exhibition, the work of, suddenly I'm blanking out on the name, but how can that happen? He put together the airport museum in Bombay, the T2 airport museum in Bombay, and a very important figure in this imagining of the exhibitionary space as a public or a national space. So one was to look at that and to look at the history of drawing in pedagogy, because I think that is something that is very, 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 very crucial to look at, the history of drawing that is sort of generated. And I also was involving a lot of contemporary artists like Vishwa Shroff, Jitish Kalat, Atul Doria, 3 contemporary artists who had worked with this kind of material in their art practice, independent of my exhibition. But to sort of look at the history of drawing and the range of work that exists, right from Stella Kramrisch, who has the Calcutta and Bauhaus, the Shantiniketan, who's part of that history of the connection between Bauhaus and Shantiniketan, or as I said, Kumaraswamy, or even later writings of somebody like K.G. Subramaniam, all of them talking about either questions of tradition, questions of structure, and how certain structures in design or art are based on a certain Hindu imagination or a sort of Islamic imagination. And when you dig into the archives of the JJ School of Arts, thanks to the professor there, Mustansir Dalvi, who's done extensive work now on that material, and he's brought out a lot of material for some of us to look at, you realize how the Claude Batley portfolio of Indian design is produced, and how just any typical house in Pune suddenly becomes a Hindu way of building a house or an Islamic way of building a house, and how these binaries, these sort of modernish binaries, start emerging. So one was to look at the history of drawing in pedagogy, but also the history of museum structures. And that's where I borrowed the works of Atul Doria, who's recently done this sort of fascinating sort of so many MoMAs in India. What would be a MoMA in India, and how the sort of Frank Gehry-ish or Zaha Hadid MoMAs would parachute into, say, Rajpipla, or these kind of, far urban spaces or small urban spaces of India. So there was that history, looking at a lot of archival material that I could get from the Baudajilad Museum, from the other museum, from my other research, etc. And I think in the question of craftsmanship, I purposely and compulsorily missed the whole national movement, because I think it's probably a good time to give the national history of the 40s, 50s, 80s that has been spoken about a certain rest. And I jumped totally into the contemporary. And I actually looked at about 14 projects of architects and only 2 designers, 14 projects of architects where I felt the question of craft was important, without sort of waving the flag that I'm working with craftsmen, I'm sort of collaborating with a craftsman, which a lot of architects do. They sort of make a whole fetishized object out of the craftsman, the craft engagement, or the collaboration with the craftsman. But I actually picked up projects where you can see that there is a subtle involvement of a craft, even if it is work with steel, or even if it is work with a certain kind of a mechanism of a vertical garden, or the way certain brick handling, which is done through a computer program. But there also, there is that question of craftsmanship. So one wanted to sort of shift that question of craftsmanship, including looking at the work of somebody like Ruchard Shroff, who sort of looks at that engagement as an experiment of explorations, of material exploration, without bothering that there is a material and a material needs a real representation, which even I don't believe any longer. It was a modern, early, mid-20th century obsession that every material has its original sort of, like Louis Kahn's every brick wants to be an arch. And today we know that at IIM in Ahmedabad, that the brick is tired of being an arch and it is falling down, literally. So I'm not a big fan of that, that sort of little small thesis. And sort of to look at the work of Tara Books, where clearly there is a continued long-term investment and engagement with the craftsmen, but engaging with real politics of the present time, of the contemporary, whether it's the politics of the craftsmen, the question of the regions that we see as tribal forests, the politics of land, industrial development in those areas, and the way that comes to an urban reader. So one sort of literally created, in the larger exhibition, one literally created this parallel zone of engagement with a design history that came from literally the last 150 years of India. And in many ways, for the few weeks that I was there, a few days that I was there, even after we installed and we opened and we had a couple of seminars, lectures, etc. with each other, one could immediately see that how parallel histories was actually a fascinating way of engaging with the knowledge we produce in the world, rather than sort of this question of influence, that Bauhaus happened, how has it influenced India? Okay, or Indian nationalism happened, how has it affected the rest of Asia or South Asia or something? So rather than these sort of, and reversing the direction is of no use. That I think we all in intelligent ways know that reversing the direction is absolutely of no use. but it is about seeing the nature of parallelness, the nature of confluences, and the nature of flows, which may be multi-directional. That became useful for me. So in many ways, this sort of occasion of 100 years of Bauhaus has helped me, only sort of given me more sort of fuel to think about my sort of larger interest in what shapes the history of design in modern and contemporary India. If I don't want to sort of look at colonialism as a lens or as a break or as a threshold, or if I sort of understand Orientalism, but I'm not going to take that lens as the guiding principle, nor do I want to take nationalism as the guiding principle, rather than an event in history, which also creates a certain kind of a series of occasions, other events, etc. So this is how I had approached, and I've continued to sort of keep that structure, including, I think, when this exhibition was in Delhi, if I'm not mistaken, they had organized a conference, and somehow we landed up chatting, and I expressed very clearly that I was unhappy with the way that conference was organized, because there was a forced pulling in of people into that conference who had probably nothing to do with Bauhaus or design histories, but just to say that, okay, you're a curator of contemporary architecture, now you say what is Bauhaus in India. Oh, you are teaching in India, you've just set up, teaching in Bombay, you've just set up a school. Oh, you tell us what is Bauhaus in India. But there was no sort of nothing in their work, and I knew most of the people who were invited on that conference, their work. I said, there's nothing integral in their work. There is nothing continuing in their work which engages with that question. So why force yourself to engage with that question? But this historical moment can productively be used for putting our heads to sort of think of other things, like what would be a design history of modern and contemporary India, or some of the thematic questions that many of us have been dealing with. So I think what I will do is, I think I've taken more than enough time probably, but thank you very much. Nobody came and told me, yeah, no, there's not even a message in the chat that I should stop, but I will stop now. Thank you very, very much. But let me sort of take this opportunity also to introduce both the wonderful panelists that we have with us this evening. And I'm sort of looking forward to listening to them because of the work that they have been involved in, which, as I know from some of our earlier conversations, etc., there are many overlaps in our thinking, in our areas of interest. Let me introduce Suchitra Balasubrahmanyan. Suchitra teaches at the School of Design, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Her research interests center on the intersections between craft, design, and nationalism in India against the backdrop of decolonization and World War diplomacy. Her publications include Moving Away from Bauhaus and Ulm, Bauhaus Imaginista Online Journal 2019, Craft and Design in the Hindu Way of Life in the Encyclopedia of Asian Design Volume 4, Transnational and Global Issues in Asian Design, Bloomsbury 2018, Imagining the Indian Nation, the Design of Gandhi's Dandi March and Nehru's Republic Day Parade in Designing World's National Design Histories in the Age of Globalization. So reading Suchitra's little brief bio note also reminds me that in the sort of the parallel to Bauhaus exhibition that I put together, my center object, my fulcrum object, was actually Gandhi's charkha and the lota. I think at one point, Gandhi's charkha is a direction in conversations on nation, craftsmanship, labor, work, the symbolism of that and the reality of that. On the other hand, it is the lota which the Eames paper celebrated, and on which sort of National Institute of Design really sort of put all its sort of energy and fascination into it. But I think there are also questions to that fascination. But I think these two objects for me became, in a way, fun objects to place literally at the center of the exhibition that I had put together. The other panelist that we have with us today is Alison Crawshaw. Alison is a registered architect, and she set up her studio in 2014 after 10 years of practice in London and New York. The studio pursues a design-led and interdisciplinary approach to architecture through her portfolio that includes landscape, urban design, buildings, installations. Alison works internationally across public and private sectors on projects of various scales and typology. She has extensive experience in design and delivery of public space and urban strategy, and a thorough understanding of arts practice and institutions, and has collaborated with many contemporary artists and galleries. She has tutored at a number of architecture schools, including Cambridge University, the Architectural Association, the Royal College of Art in London, as well as Bauhaus Dessau. So there is an authentic voice. If people love authentic voices, then there is a voice that has experienced Dessau in a way. Just joking here. She was Rome Scholar in Architecture, exhibitor in the international section of the Venice Biennale, and was shortlisted for the Harvard University's Wheelwright Prize. So very happy and honored to be with both of you all this evening. May I invite Alison to make her presentation, and then we will have Suchitra making her presentation. Yes. And then we, all three of us, will come back, maybe have a conversation between ourselves, and then we can open it up for audience questions. Thank you, everyone. And Alison, maybe have your presentation.
Great. Yeah, I have sort of quite a brief presentation and probably come at it from a slightly different perspective from others on the panel this evening, in that I come at the question of the relevance of the Bauhaus today sort of more as a designer than a curator or academic. And also, obviously, I'm based in London. So thanks for the introduction. And my sort of relationship to the Bauhaus is that I taught workshops at the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, and also worked on the exhibition design of Still Undead, the UK chapter of the Bauhaus Imaginista project, which was an exhibition at Nottingham Contemporary. I think that when we came together as a panel earlier this week to meet briefly, I think what we shared was an interest in a living legacy of the Bauhaus, rather than thinking of its legacy as a sort of catalogue of iconic building projects and design products. And this is certainly something that was part of our approach in sort of the teaching that I did at Dessau, and also in the Still Undead exhibition. With the workshops in Dessau, the brief was conceived by Regina Bittner, who is the Deputy Director at the Bauhaus Foundation. And they were called Get On Site and Everywhere is Home. And Dessau is a shrinking city. I think at the time when I was teaching there, its population had shrunk by something like 10,000 to be a population of 80,000 over the previous 5 years. So it's quite a sort of extreme situation. And what the workshops were setting out to do was sort of explore what role the Bauhaus Institute could play in this context, what role it could play in the city. And in our proposal, it was quite literal, really, just sort of overlaid the historic Bauhaus school on contemporary Dessau. And each of our students took a space from the Bauhaus building and found a corresponding space in the city, and made an intervention in the city. And these interventions made use of the formal language and the spirit of the Bauhaus, from the literal recreation of historic events to a more general sense of exploration and experiment, whilst performing specific functions within the city. So the workshops were really a very sort of pragmatic experiment, taking the ideas and sort of the methodologies of from examples that we found in the Bauhaus archive, and really making design proposals for them. So just kind of using it as a resource, as an urban designer. And with the Still Undead exhibition. That was part of the wider Bauhaus Imaginista research project. And as I say, like I wasn't part of the kind of curatorial team. I was working as an exhibition designer on the exhibition. But like the project as a whole, the UK chapter sort of looked at the Bauhaus as a transcultural exchange. And it was interested in how the approaches and sort of production that were developed in Weimar and Dessau and Berlin shifted as students and professors of the school moved out of Germany, and how they fused with other contexts. And what was interesting in the UK to me was that the Bauhaus professors and students, they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. They weren't given, fantastic teaching positions in the leading institutions here. They weren't given sort of huge building commissions. And of the content, the content in the Still Undead chapter, the UK chapter of the Bauhaus Imaginista project it was really varied, the content, but the pieces that I was really drawn to within it were ones where the sort of alumni from the Bauhaus were kind of working slightly outside of British society and sort of observing British society. So sort of using all of the formal training like developed at the Bauhaus and bringing the sort of political ideology from the Bauhaus, bringing that to British society. That was kind of the works in the show that really, that I was personally very drawn to. So examples of this were, for example, the photographs of Edith Tudor Hart, who was a British-Austrian photographer, and she was an anti-fascist and a communist. And she documented sort of the beginnings of the post-war welfare state here in the UK, because her husband was a doctor. And so she kind of had access to these settings. And with her training at the Bauhaus, she had this interest in light and sort of the contrast of light and dark, and so she was kind of capturing and documenting these rooms where they were kind of doing experimental light treatments on patients, and so, as I said before, just this sort of fusion of formal technique and political ideology and observing a sort of very conservative society that was in transition, sort of slightly from the outside, was something that really drew my attention. Another example of a photographer who is kind of working in the same, from a similar position was, and her photographs were also in the show, was Lucia Maholi, and she documented sort of British class society, the class hierarchy here, and did a series of portraits of Oxford dons and their wives. So I think that in the UK, there was, a sort of very specific lens that that Bauhaus alumni kind of brought to the UK. The other sort of part of the Still Undead content that was striking to me was a section on the foundation course. The foundation course in the UK, has is fundamental part of UK art education. Many architects and artists have a sort of a year foundation course, which is really come from the Bauhaus preliminary course. So its whole kind of pedagogical structure is sort of based on the sort of interdisciplinarity that the preliminary course set up, and I think that it's been hugely relevant here to it's really kind of shaped design, because so many students have kind of passed through that year. So I think that in terms of the relevance of the Bauhaus, as I said earlier on, I'm interested in a sort of a living legacy, like how the sort of the kind of processes and ways of seeing live on, more than sort of ossified building projects and sort of iconic design products. And I'm going to hand over now, pass back to India.
Thank you, Alison, very much for this insight and sense into this other edition. And maybe we could have Suchitra do her presentation now. Thanks, Suchitra.
Thanks, Kaiwan. Thanks, Alison, and also to Sharmishta and Astrid for including me in this panel discussion. Many things to respond to, but let me quickly go over some of the ideas that I am preoccupied with. I have a small presentation to share with you. So I'll just get that started. Okay. What I would like to add to today's discussion is bringing in some ideas about transnational flows, which sort of preceded the Bauhaus connection to India, or the, I don't even want to call it influence, but the connection, and how the colonial state as well as the post-colonial Indian state, markets and civil society play a role in the way design in India shapes up. I mean, these are some ideas I'm trying to develop, so it may not be as kind of fully fleshed out, but I'm sure in the discussion we could kind of plug some gaps in the arguments. So like Kaiwan, I too tend to look at the 1851 exhibition, Great Exhibition in London, as a starting point for Indian design. And I think the objects from India which were displayed there did significantly start the discussion around design in the modern sense in which we use the term. Kaiwan had mentioned Arindam Datta's book. He, of course, explores all of this in great detail, and many of you must be also familiar with his work. But what interested me was also the kind of repercussions it not only has in England, in Britain, setting up what later became Royal College of Art and the Victoria and Albert Museum, but also the Sir J.J. School of Art in Mumbai in the middle of the 19th century. But I was most struck by Sir Jamshedji Jijiboy's preoccupation. He was, I neglected to say that he was part of a committee which sent objects from the Bombay Presidency to the Great Exhibition. And in the process of being associated with that committee work to select objects, he realized that it would be important to have a school for the improvement of arts and manufacture. So I think about this as how markets get involved in the considerations around an art school. And he hoped that it would develop local skills, develop local industries, and expand profits and create employment, so that India could take up an advanced position amongst the manufacturing countries of the world. So this idea that a school of industrial arts or applied arts or commercial art, these are the many terms that then come up in the 19th century, are going to be directly related to the economy is a recurring theme. And I'll show how 150 years later it reflects in the national design policy of India. So here we have the state intervening quite proactively through its association with the merchant class, which Sir Jamshedji Jijibhoy represents, in order to look into economies of production, moving away from crafts-based production into industrial manufacture. So this is also the reason why I see, like Kaiwan does, perhaps in a different way, the beginning of a very modern way of using the word design. We also need to think about, here I want to reference not Shanti Niketan as much as Sri Niketan and Tagore's thinking around craft and manufacture and developing products. Unfortunately, there's not much time to talk about how Sri Niketan and the products it made kind of catered to what I think of as an urban Calcutta-based market, though I don't know too much about this. Perhaps in the discussion, some of you could add some more details. But this going back to manufacturing by the hand, being concerned about craft, but creating products for early 20th century Calcutta, perhaps. And this also raises some questions about Sri Niketan's connections with local craft, maybe problematic relations with the Santals who were the original inhabitants of that area. But just to flag off that there is a kind of idea which is generating out of Sri Niketan, which also adds to the questions around craft manufacture. I'm skipping, obviously, the contemporary kind of discourse which takes place in the western side of India, Ahmedabad and the Gandhian movement, but since all of us are quite familiar with it. I'm skipping now to independence and the Indian state and Cold War diplomacy. This is also a time in which you see really strong transnational flows. The post-colonial Indian state is trying to project itself through exhibitions such as the Textile and Ornamental Arts of India. And this is the catalogue of the exhibition is quite revealing. And I'm just reading an essay by Pupul Jayakar, a little excerpt from the essay she does in the catalogue of the she's now the chairperson of the All India Handicrafts Board, which has been set up to look into craft production. And she worries in her article called Indian Fabrics in Indian Life, she worries about the introduction of an alien concept of the designer as distinct from the craftsman. And she's worried that it's going to destroy the craftsman's natural response to good form. She's also, it's actually quite a bit of a lament of an essay. And she says to go back to the past is impossible, for that past was background to a life that has no longer any meaning. So what is the new social order? How is it transformed by new forms of communication, roads, access, and so on? And the ever-present, what she sees as a kind of danger of absorption of Western forms and coming into contact with craft. what is going to be possible then. So she's the very person who initiates the process of establishing what would then become the National Institute of Design and the Industrial Design Center, is actually worrying about what a designer might do in the 1950s landscape of independent India. It's well known that part of the cultural diplomacy post the Cold War took the form of Russian, British, French, German, and American presence in India, and a key role that was played by the Ford Foundation in funding these kinds of transnational flows from Euro-American design institutes. But we must see design here at against the landscape of the introduction of many new disciplines of education. So management education is introduced here. The Ford Foundation plays a huge role in the establishment of the Indian Institute of Management and for funding Louis Kahn to build their Ahmedabad campus. They fund Charles and Ray Eames to suggest how design education should be established in India. So here I just want to point out that there is transnational flows from different areas, and what would later become the National Institute of Design drew its pedagogy not only from the Ulm school, but also from Swiss graphic design. It drew its textile design pedagogy from Scandinavian design. So we have many influences coming in, and not only the Bauhaus pedagogic influence via the Ulm school. Another point to be underlined here is the growing tension between craft production and industrial production. So the Eameses were invited to suggest how small industries could be stimulated through a design institution, and they talked instead about the production of the lotas of the time. So they see the exemplars of design in craft production, and the same tension that you see in Jamshedji Jijibhoy is kind of echoed in another way. So as I said, you have two design institutes which were set up in the 60s, the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad and the Industrial Design Center in IIT Bombay. We could discuss more about this in the discussions if it comes up, if it's interesting, to talk about how the setting in the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, where National Institute of Design was located, and the Industrial Design Center is located in the Indian Institute of Technology, which is under the Department of Science and Technology. So you have two different kind of trajectories of design which take off, which is also something that we could look at. Another moment right after after the writing of the India report by the Eames was a design from Europe and America, Good Design exhibition that arrives, again funded by the Ford Foundation, to promote modern European and American design through a MoMA exhibition, which traveled to 9 cities in India. It was housed in a geodesic dome by Buckminster Fuller, and some 400 objects came, which here you can see Bauhaus objects. And the purpose of the exhibition are we've just heard from the Eames about the Lota, and then the very next year this exhibition arrives, where the Minister for Commerce and Industry says that the purpose of the exhibition is to bring attention of the Indian public to the aesthetic values of the West and largely machine-made and mass-produced objects. And so he was very aware that there is a cultural exchange going on here. And he hoped that the designs exhibited here will provide an inspiration to Indian manufacturers and craftsmen. So I just picked out some of these excerpts just to show that there is a continuing tension and preoccupation between what seems to be seemingly irreconcilable opposition, binary kind of spaces of craft and design. It's interesting to know that this collection of objects which came with this exhibition were then housed as a teaching collection at the National Institute of Design for teaching students on campus about what is good design. So there was Lota on the one hand, and there were these objects on the other, which were supposed to be the exemplars of good design, and it was up to students to sort of figure out what was what. I talked about civil society, how they facilitate these transnational flows, and I'm just taking the example of two magazines. One, Marg, many of you know it, which begins publication in 1946, and they have the early issues have articles by Corbusier, messages from Richard Neutra, and articles by Frank Lloyd Wright. But in the editorial, soon after this journal starts, it's an art, architecture, and magazine, which has articles about ancient Indian art, medieval art, so the classical Indian arts, folk arts, as well as design. But what its editor Mulk Raj Anand says very categorically in 1948, India is just newly independent, and he writes, a new Bauhaus is needed for India, not an imitation of the one at Dessau. From this would come a fresh-minded approach to our problems. So this awareness of the existence of the Bauhaus, but a kind of, not a rejection of it, but a kind of interpretation of it in the local landscape and the local historical moment was very important, not just a blind reproduction of what went on in post interwar period in Germany. It's also important to see the markets and the publics that Marg was reaching out to, and we get a glimpse of it in the advertisements in the magazine. These are from the 1960s, and you can see how design, modern living, a kind of Western look is being propagated through the advertisement pages of the journal. So designs for modern living is propagating tubular furniture. Tata's own textiles. Tata was the funder of the magazine, was advertising content which was quite at an angle, at a remove from its editorial content, yet not totally, because the magazine was also promoting modern design. So here's an issue from 1970, which was celebrating the National Institute of Design with an issue termed Design for Living. So this idea that design is going to shape lifestyles, but quite an elite, urban, kind of middle class, upper middle class audience. Equally, the journal was talking about handicrafts in the nation's economy. And here is an article on contemporary design development in handlooms by K.G. Subramaniam, who is a Shanti Niketan trained artist who later becomes a very important figure in the Baroda school, but whose job, perhaps his early job, was with the Weavers Service Center, and he's developed designs for handlooms. So Marg also shows some of these multi-stranded preoccupations in the 60s and 70s. Another equally influential magazine was Design. This, while it was like Marg, it was edited from Bombay and then it shifted to Delhi. The editorial board had many former Bauhaus members, as you can see. They carried critiques and reviews of the Bauhaus. Since Walter Gropius was on their editorial board, they condoled his death in 1969. So there was an awareness. What I'm trying to say is that the English language press as represented by these two journals, did circulate a lot of material about modern design, but not just the Bauhaus, from all over the Euro-American context, which was received by an English reading upper class readership in India. So here are some pages from design, an article on Ulm, the products at Ulm, and advertisements here from the All India Handicrafts Board promoting design, again for design for living. So the kind of repetition echo of this term design for living is quite striking over about a 20-25 year period after independence. So how we can think about the kind of emerging ideas circulating about design becomes, these journals become a kind of way of understanding what actually, but to remember that these were largely an urban, a certain kind of economic strata. Also here one can see the idea of consumers, what kinds of products they are looking for, what kind of lifestyles they are looking for, and how these are being supplied by the corporations of that time, by the manufacturers of that time, and how they are also thinking about design. So I'll just skip, make a leap of about 50 years to the National Design Policy, which came out in 2007, talking once again about how the state is intervening on what design should be and how it should be thought about. So just to give you a few glimpses of this, it's a 3-4 page document, but it is preoccupied with a global positioning and branding of Indian designs and making designed in India a byword for quality and utility in conjunction with made in India and served from India. It would be interesting to place this side by side with what Jamshedji Jijibhai was talking about. It's 150 years about between the two, and quite a similar way of thinking about how art and design is going to aid manufacture. The National Design Policy is also preoccupied with the creation of original Indian designs in products and services, drawing upon India's rich craft tradition and cultural heritage. So you have manufacture, mass manufacture, and hand manufacture sort of sitting side by side, and making the National Design Policy also envisages making India a major hub for exports and outsourcing of designs and creative processes for achieving a design-enabled innovation economy. So you have the economy central to the way design is being thought about at several points in the last 150 years. It's also interesting to see how America, Europe is interested in being in India. So it's not just one way flow. Equally, there are people who are interested in markets, interested in maintaining a geopolitical presence in India, and design becomes a conduit for cultural diplomacy. So I think what I was trying to see is the interlaced relationship between design, state, market, and civil society, and in a way, each producing the other. More can be said about it. Perhaps we could discuss it later on. There are national and international protagonists and audiences, and I could even add interests in this transnational flow. And all the while, there is a tension between tradition and the modern, hand manufacture and industrial production. And this sort of continues through the 150-year period, unresolved perhaps to this day, and perhaps that's what keeps it kind of in a state of interest and creative tension, perhaps. I'll end here and hand it over to Kaiwan, and let's see how the discussions bring up some of these points, perhaps, or not. Thank you.
Suchitra, thank you so very much for this presentation. And I think what I mentioned, sort of parallel histories, you also nicely put it as tensions, and the different sort of flows that are happening besides one particular one or something. So that was and that was, I think, very, very important for us. And I think what we can do is, after we've had these detailed presentations with many references, if there are any sort of questions from the audience, and maybe Sharmishta can help us, will they be typed in the chat box, or Sharmishta, will you route them to us? Sharmishta? Well, till Sharmishta comes and tells us if there are questions from the audience. Alison, I was wondering if while working with this exhibition, there was something between your teaching and observing at the exhibition that drew special attention, or it was like, oh shit, this is how it happened, or this is what I was thinking. Was there some moment or example that you would like to sort of share?
Oh, with the I suppose what I was saying when I kind of joined the presentation before, that it's quite sort of different, sort of joining it as a designer.
Yes, that's why I'm asking.
And sort of thinking, you know, because when we were working in Dessau on these workshops with the students, the Bauhaus archive was just, it was such a rich resource. And so when there's this question of, you know, like, what's the relevance of the Bauhaus today? You know, if you're kind of asking, you know, huge kind of, you know, geopolitical questions, and then you know, there, you know, it's a very kind of complex arguments that are formulated, whereas as a designer, you can kind of just pick and choose from these sort of from this incredible resource. Some of the things that we did, just to kind of explain some of the kind of workshop projects that we did. As I said, we were trying to sort of activate and, you know, explore Dessau, the shrinking city. So one example was, there was a sort of an underpass, a disused underpass, and we took a photographer's studio in the city and took that studio out into the underpass and like recreated some of the photographs from the sort of performances in the Bauhaus. So, you know, just sort of, and in that one, it was, you're probably familiar with some of the photography from the performances, but it was one where they all kind of hold a word that kind of prompts an action, and that was kind of one example. There were others where, because Dessau is a sort of post-industrial situation, so there's kind of huge swathes of you know, kind of workshops, empty workshops and stuff, but there's some manufacturing left there. So we worked with manufacturers in the city to, you know, find old window frames and kind of make new street furniture with them. So, you know, it was a very sort of live, a live fusion of archive, the Bauhaus as an archive, and this context of a shrinking city. So that's just kind of coming at it as a designer, right? But then in terms of what, you know, what I was trying to say about the you know, what interested me in the exhibition was it's sort of the ways of looking at things that photographers such as Edith Tudor Hart or Lucia Maholi, you know, I still find that relevant. The way that they kind of position themselves outside of society and bring sort of fuse sort of political ideology with formal training. yeah, I still find that relevant, but it's a very, you know, it's a small, I'm coming at it from like the micro maybe.
that makes it richer. In fact, the micro makes it richer. That's the beautiful part about this sort of bringing the archive or looking at the archive simultaneously while looking at a situation like the city shrinking as it exists today and going empty. In at least the example that you gave, I think shrinking is one thing, and how cities can sometimes go empty, and what happens with that. Thanks for sharing that. Suchitra, yes, please.
Sorry, I wanted to just ask Alison, you know, I was just thinking that somehow, maybe wrongly so, I have an association of the Bauhaus as a very West German thing, you know, and Dessau is like the former East Germany, right? And so it has a history which has gone off in a different direction and then kind of come back into a unified. Your work was post that history, you know. So it just came to my mind that there is that little gap in the way we think about Germany. Perhaps sitting here we think like that. Maybe you're more aware of.
Dessau, I mean, Dessau feels like that so much. Like there's these huge streets that cut through, you know, cutting through the city that are, you know, they're completely out of scale, because it's also a shrinking city. So these huge kind of highways. So it feels very odd, and this kind of industrial history, and then the Bauhaus right there with all of its cultural, this huge cultural archive. So, you know, such a rich resource. So it's a really interesting kind of context.
So almost like a break, no, like a historical.
It's kind of fractured.
The other thing I remembered was your mention of the preliminary course. You know, it brought back, you were talking about Britain still having some element of that.
Yes, Britain here in Britain, there is something called the foundation course, which kind of comes from, it's related to basic design, which was sort of emerged in the 50s and 60s here, I think. And with the foundation course, it still exists today. And you know, most of the people coming through into art school, into architecture school, have kind of done a foundation course, and the foundation course is still, I teach on the foundation course. The foundation course still, it's kind of, interdisciplinary. It's like there's so many connections to the basic, to the preliminary course, and it just strikes me that, you know, it's quite an important moment in a student's education when they're 18 years old.
Yeah.
It's very it's very formative. It's their first experience of you know how to think, how to be an artist, how to be a designer, an architect, whatever. So in terms of kind of the relevance of the Bauhaus today, it's quite a strong one.
I remember my first visit to the Bauhaus archives in Berlin and seeing the foundation course, and I got the shock of my life. My teachers had invented, you know, all of that, and suddenly I felt, oh, I have this plagiarized education, you know. So it shook me because we were not told anything of this. So it's almost like finding you have other biological parents, so, you know, something like that. So your mention brought back that memory. Sorry, Kaiwan, you were saying.
No, this was wonderful, Suchitra, because actually I wanted to ask you, what are your observations on the current, except for this foundation? In fact, except in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, they have reintroduced the foundation program, which a lot of people from the different faculties also have a problem, because the foundation course is common for architecture, design, everybody, and then you branch out from the second year. So, and there is a question whether it is too much standardization. What is the level of standardization? also, what are the nuggets that you give? Because, even if you're doing an art and history kind of a program, then, like, for example, a person who comes from that direction, it's just nuggets. There is not an overview that you can give, because you're trying to pack that much into a foundation course. So the practicalities of the foundation course, besides the exercises that you plan out, is interesting in the way then, because I really drew my attention to you saying that it's true that it's a student is 18 years old, and it's foundational for a person to really from that point think that now I'm a designer, now I'm an architect from doing this course. So that was an interesting question, Suchitra, and I was wanted to ask you, what are your observations on the contemporary design education? Because I don't think there is any real strong idea driving contemporary design education in our context in that way. There are maybe some old hangover ideas, some new imaginations, but there is no real structure or thought that is saying that, this is our notion of designers, or this is what we want our designers to be doing. Even if it is something more straightforward, fine, but even that direction, at least I'm not able to perceive that. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on that, Suchitra.
Yeah. So at Ambedkar University at the School of Design, it's a strange, unusual situation. I have actually left the place 6 weeks back.
Okay.
Weeks back, but it is a school of design plonked in the middle of a social sciences and humanities university. So it's actually an ecosystem which is a very different one. So either in India, Alison, just for your reference, we have either standalone design institutions which just do design or architecture and design, or they are located in technology institutions. So this was the first one, which was, we had anthropologists on one side and economists on the other, and psychologists in the block behind, this kind of thing. And it's an enormously rich place where we developed this master's program in social design. So basically trying to look at design at the intersection of rights, activism, social sciences, sustainability, and the city. So being connected to Delhi, being informed by its history. So the pedagogy being informed by the history and geography of the location of the school. These were some of the kinds of experiments we did in developing the program. So, and it also tried to move away from aesthetics of just form, but also looking at experience, trying to get into phenomenology. And I think we tried to do too much. So it sort of became slightly unwieldy, but also trying to think of design education in conjunction with the social sciences and the humanities. So trying to really reimagine the formal aesthetics oriented training. But of course, this was at a master's level, but it was interesting because we had lawyers who signed up for the course, and people who had done information technology or aeronautical engineering and psychology and all kinds of different things, So the classroom dynamics, so you don't have any presuppositions of what they know. So it was almost like starting over. And we also realized how undergraduates have different self-images, evolving self-images. So they may have signed up for doing engineering, but they kind of in the master's program really begin to do what they think about, So that was just to respond to your question, Kaiwan, a kind of experiment. Still a work in progress, I have to say, but we sort of tilted at the windmills a little bit.
No, wonderful to know this, because I didn't know the details of the design program at Ambedkar. So thanks for sharing that. But yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. So Sharmishta, if we don't have any further questions, we've sort of been up for 1.5 hours with like 3 presentations, I think, with many ideas that we've all shared in terms of our personal inquiries, personal experiences, but also thinking over broad histories. And as I was saying that, this 100 years of Bauhaus, whether Bauhaus is relevant or not, more than that, I think it has allowed us, obviously, it has allowed us to sort of get into many questions like this. Also, the changing nature of what we may imagine as design, or what we imagined as designed about 150 years ago. Because I had an experience of some people who were patrons in setting up a design school suddenly realized that, when there was product design and textile design, they said, but this is not what we imagined as design. Probably they had more sort of management imagination of design and design thinking and that. And so it was a sudden thing that a patron had completely misunderstood what he or she was going to sort of support. So I think it is, and I think that is something that one is, I think Suchitra and me both pointed out about 1851 and that moment, but also the questions of whether it is the question of certain urban histories or city histories changing, or it is a completely changing mindset of a culture or of a public that starts looking at design or design intervention or this category of this person called the designer, and what he or she is going to do, whether this role is seen as a serious political investment, as a serious material contribution, or it is a certain kind of a fashion imagination that is going to take over. I think with changing economics, that is also what has happened. The imagination of design itself has probably changed, and that needs an investigation as much. So thank you, Alison and Suchitra, for really sharing your experiences. It was wonderful speaking to both of you a week ago. It was wonderful listening to both of you all today, and I'm happy we were together on this panel. And thank you very much, Astrid and Sharmishta, for getting us together. And I hand it over to Astrid to maybe close the event.
Okay, thank you so much. To all of you, to the speakers, to Suchitra, Balasubrahmanyan, to Alison Crawshaw and Kaiwan Mehta, for sharing your thoughts and your insights on the parallel histories in art design, architecture, art education, markets, nation states. So that was really super interesting, a very lively discussion and conversation. So thank you so much. Our thanks also goes to the Indian Museum once again, and to the Minister of Culture for their support. And of course, I would like to thank all of you who joined us this evening in this panel discussion, listening to it. So a big thanks goes to the audience. This was our last panel discussion for the moment, but we will see how we continue, and definitely Bauhaus, it will be not our last event on Bauhaus and its relevance today. So again, once again, thank you so much to all the speakers. That was really a very nice conclusion tonight and today, and see you soon in a different conversation and discussion. Thank you, goodbye.